Tonight, we are going to discover someone remarkable, someone whose name has slipped through the cracks of history like silk through fingers, a princess whose gentle presence touched countless lives, yet whose story has been waiting centuries to be whispered into the darkness of a peaceful night. Her tale isn't one of grand battles or dramatic rescues. No, it's something far more precious. A story of quiet kindness that echoed through stone corridors and bloomed in forgotten gardens. Whether you're nestled in mountains or settled by the sea, wherever you are in this vast, sleeping world, I hope you've found that perfect spot where your body can truly rest. Perhaps you've already adjusted your pillow just so, pulled your blanket up to that comfortable place. If this story brings you the peace you're seeking tonight, a gentle like helps others find their way to rest too. Let your shoulders soften now, feeling their weight sink gently into whatever is supporting you. Notice how your breath is already beginning to slow, how the day's concerns are starting to dissolve like morning mist over a quiet lake. The temperature around you, is it just right? Allow yourself this moment to simply be. We are drifting back through layers of time, back to when candlelight danced on tapestried walls, when the world moved at the pace of horseback and sailing ships. The year was 1487, and in a small duchy nestled between what would later become the borders of three great nations, a child was born on an unusually warm September evening. The Duchy of Valdora, though you won't find it on modern maps, once occupied a gentle valley where three rivers met, their waters joining in a slow, peaceful dance that merchants used to navigate between larger kingdoms. This child, this little princess, was named Elisabetta, though her nurse called her Leta, and her mother simply whispered "little dove" when she held her close. The castle where Leta first opened her eyes wasn't one of those imposing fortresses you might imagine. No, it was more of a manor house that had grown over centuries, adding a tower here, a wing there, like a comfortable old tree adding rings. The stones were honey-colored limestone that caught the afternoon sun and held its warmth long into the evening. In the summer months, you could press your palm against those walls after sunset and still feel the day's gentle heat radiating through. Leta's first memories were of textures, the rough wool of her nurse's sleeve against her cheek, the smooth, cool pearls her mother wore that clicked softly when she moved, the surprising softness of her father's beard when he lifted her up to see over the castle walls. The Duke, Alessandro, was a man who understood that true strength often wore the disguise of gentleness. His lands were small, his army modest, but his libraries were full, and his granaries were always opened during harsh winters. The co-Duchess, Caterina, had come from Siena, bringing with her the musical cadence of Tuscan Italian and recipes for almond cakes that filled the castle kitchens with sweet, warm fragrances. She had artists' hands, long and graceful, and she spent her mornings in the solar, working on illuminated manuscripts while humming melodies that seemed to float through the air like dandelion seeds. When Leta was 3 years old enough to toddle through the herb garden, but young enough to still nap in the afternoon sun like a cat, the castle hosted a gathering of neighboring nobles. It was nothing grand. Valdora couldn't afford grand, but there was music from traveling minstrels and torches that made the courtyard glow amber and gold. Leta watched from her mother's arms as dancers moved in slow circles, their shadows stretching and shrinking on the walls like gentle breathing. The child had peculiar eyes, not quite green, not quite grey. They seemed to change with the weather, deepening to forest moss before rain, lightening to river stone in sunshine. The court astronomer, an elderly man named Benedetto who spent more time tending his roses than studying stars, declared that she had listening eyes, eyes that heard more than they saw. In those early years, the rhythm of castle life moved as predictably as the seasons. Spring brought merchants from the south, their carts creaking under loads of dyed cloth and spices that made the air shimmer with the scent of far-off places. Summer meant the sound of scythes in distant fields, that whispered swoosh swoosh that carried on warm breezes. Autumn filled the courtyards with the rustle of fallen leaves and the sweet smell of apple pressing. And winter. Winter wrapped the castle in a blanket of quietness, where the only sounds were the settling of old wood and the soft conversations by firelight. Leta learned to walk in the castle's long gallery, where portraits of ancestors watched with painted eyes that seemed kindly rather than stern. Her small feet made barely a whisper on the worn stone floors. Her nurse, Margarita, a woman whose voice had the quality of wool, soft and warming, would tell her stories about each portrait. "That one there," she would say, pointing to a woman in a blue gown, "was your great-great-grandmother Isabella. She kept bees and knew every flower in the valley by name." The princess's education began gently. Like everything in Valdora seemed to begin. Brother Francis, borrowed from the nearby monastery, taught her letters using honey cakes shaped like the alphabet. Each letter eaten was a letter learned, he said. Though Leta suspected he simply enjoyed watching a child's delight at the sweet rewards. The letters swam before her eyes at first, little black fish in a sea of parchment, but gradually they settled into meaning. Her mother taught her needlework in the solar, where the light was best in the mid-morning. Not the elaborate goldwork that grander courts favored, but simple, useful stitching, the kind that mended torn sleeves and reinforced worn seams. "Every stitch is a small prayer," Katerina would murmur, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with hypnotic regularity. "A wish for the person who will wear this, for warmth, for comfort, for gentle days." The castle had a peculiar acoustic quality. Sounds traveled in unexpected ways through its corridors. Leta discovered that if she sat in a certain corner of the chapel, she could hear the kitchen maids singing as they kneaded bread 3 floors below. Their songs were old ones, older than the castle itself, with words that had worn smooth like river stones. Sometimes she would sit there for hours, letting their voices wash over her like warm water. When Leta was 5, her father began taking her on his morning rides through the duchy. Not far, never far, just to the edge of the forest where wild strawberries grew in summer, or to the mill where the great wheel turned with a steady creaking rhythm that seemed to match a sleeping giant's breathing. The Duke's horse, an elderly mare named Stella, had a gait as smooth as rocking in a cradle. Leta would sit in front of her father, enclosed in the safe circle of his arms, watching the world pass in a gentle blur of greens and browns and sky blue. On one such ride, they encountered an old woman gathering herbs by the roadside. Her bag was bent like a question mark, and her fingers moved among the plants with the certainty of long practice. The Duke stopped to greet her. In Vildora, even dukes stopped for their people. And the old woman looked up at Leta with eyes clouded by age but still somehow sharp. "Ah," she said, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "The little princess with the listening eyes. She'll need them, this one. The world is about to become very loud, but she'll hear the quiet things, the important things." Her father's arms tightened slightly around Leta, but his voice remained steady as he thanked the woman and continued on their way. Later, much later, Leta would understand the old woman's words, but at 5 she simply filed them away with all the other mysterious things adults said. The seasons turned their great slow wheel. Leta grew like a plant in shade, steadily but without drama. She learned Latin from Brother Francis, who had progressed from honey cakes to illustrating verbs with elaborate charades that made her laugh until her sides ached. She learned the properties of herbs from her mother's garden: feverfew for headaches, chamomile for sleep, lavender for peace of mind. She learned the names of every servant in the castle, from the grand steward to the boy who swept ash from the fireplaces. There was a music teacher for a while, a temperamental man from Venice who threw up his hands in despair at Leta's stubborn fingers on the lute strings. But Leta preferred listening to making music. She would sit beneath the window of the music room while he practiced, letting the notes fall around her like soft rain. Music, she discovered, didn't need to come from her own hands to fill her with its particular magic. The castle library became her refuge as she grew older. It wasn't large, 3 rooms connected by narrow arches, but it held treasures. Books bound in leather soft as butter, their pages whispering secrets when turned. Maps of places that might or might not exist, their edges decorated with sea monsters wearing expressions more curious than frightening. A book of pressed flowers, each one labeled in a spidery hand with its name and properties. The colors faded but still lovely, like memories of summers past. Old Benedetto, the astronomer gardener, taught her to read the sky as well as books. On clear nights, he would take her to the tower's highest room, where the ceiling had been painted with constellations in gold leaf against deep blue. "See there," he would say, his arthritic finger tracing patterns in the air. "That's Cassiopeia, the vain queen." But I think she was just misunderstood. Perhaps he was simply proud of her daughter and spoke too loudly about it. The gods don't always understand a parent's love. Leta's 7th year brought changes subtle as shifting light. The first was her brother's birth, a squalling red-faced boy named Marco, who arrived during a thunderstorm that shook the castle walls. Leta remembered pressing her face against the cool stone of her bedroom wall, feeling the vibrations of thunder through her cheek, while from somewhere below came the thin, insistent cry of new life. When she was finally allowed to see him, she was surprised at how small he was, how his fingers wrapped around one of hers with surprising strength. The second change was in the way adults began to look when they thought she wasn't watching. Worried glances exchanged over her head. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Maps spread on her father's desk that were quickly rolled up when she approached. The larger kingdoms around Valdora were stirring, testing borders like wolves circling a sheepfold. But in the way of children, Leta absorbed these concerns without fully understanding them. They became part of the texture of her days, like the morning mist that clung to the valley or the way shadows lengthened across the courtyard in late afternoon. Life continued its gentle rhythm. Lessons and meals, prayers and play. The turning of seasons reliable as breathing. Her mother began teaching her the art of preservation that year. Not just of foods, though she learned to make preserves from the castle's ancient quince trees. Their perfume so intense it made her dizzy. But preservation of memories, of stories, of small beauties that might otherwise be forgotten. They would sit together in the evening, Katerina showing Leta how to press flowers between sheets of fine paper, how to mix inks that would last centuries, how to write in a hand so small and precise that entire stories could fit on a single page. "Why make it so small, Mama?" Leta asked one evening, squinting at her mother's minute script. "Because, my dove," Katerina replied, not looking up from her work. "Sometimes the most important things must be hidden in plain sight. A shout can be silenced, but a whisper can slip through the cracks and survive." The castle's daily routine had a quality like honey, slow, golden, sweet. Mornings began with the bell from the monastery across the valley, its bronze voice carrying clearly through the still air. Then came the sounds of the castle waking. The creak of the well's windlass as water was drawn for the day, the clatter of pots from the kitchen, the low murmur of prayers from the chapel. Leta would lie in her bed, a carved wooden frame that had belonged to her grandmother, listening to these familiar sounds layer upon each other like threads in a tapestry. Her days followed a pattern comfortable as worn shoes. Lessons in the morning when her mind was sharpest, though Brother Francis had learned to incorporate movement into their studies. They would conjugate Latin verbs while walking the castle walls, or practice mathematics by calculating how much grain the duchy would need for winter. He was patient with her tendency to drift, understanding that her mind worked like a butterfly, alighting here and there, gathering nectar from unexpected sources. Afternoons were for ladylike pursuits, though in Valdora, ladylike had a practical bent. Yes, she learned to dance, the slow, stately pavanes that were already going out of fashion in grander courts. But she also learned to keep household accounts, to recognize when wool was of good quality, to tell from the color of the sky whether rain would come. Her mother's lessons were full of these practical magics, the everyday sorcery of running a household. There was a room in the castle that few people entered. A small chamber off the main hall where damaged tapestries were stored. Leta discovered it one rainy afternoon when she was 8, following a draft that shouldn't have existed. The tapestries were rolled and stacked like ancient scrolls, some so old their colors had faded to the gentle browns and grays of winter trees. When she carefully unrolled one, she found a scene of such quiet beauty it made her chest tight. A garden where unicorns grazed among flowering trees, their expressions peaceful and utterly unconcerned with being mythical. She began visiting that room regularly, unrolling a different tapestry each time, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor to study the stories woven in wool and silk. Some depicted battles, but even these seemed muted, the violence softened by age and the weaver's art until they looked more like elaborate dances. Others showed seasons of plenty, harvests and weddings and feast days, all rendered in stitches so fine they seemed painted. rather than sewn. It was in that room that Leta first understood something important about time, how it softened edges, how it turned even sharp sorrows into something bearable, beautiful even, like sea glass worn smooth by waves. The tapestries were proof that stories could survive, changed but not destroyed, carrying their quiet truths forward through centuries. That winter, the one when Leta was 8 and Marco was learning to walk, grabbing at furniture with chubby, determined hands, the snow fell deeper than anyone could remember. It muffled the world, turning the castle into an island of warmth in a sea of white silence. The usual visitors couldn't reach them. No merchants, no messengers, no wandering friars with news from the outside world. They were alone with themselves and the quiet. It should have been frightening, that isolation, but instead it felt like being held in cupped hands. The castle turned inward, became a complete world. Stories were told that had been saved for just such weather, long rambling tales that took entire evenings to unfold. The kitchen produced miracles from stored supplies, dishes that filled the great hall with scents of cinnamon and clove. Someone found an old puppet theater in the attics, and the servants put on shows that made even the dignified Duke laugh until tears streamed down his cheeks. Later remembered one particular evening during that snowed-in time. The great hall was lit only by the fireplace and a few candles, creating pools of gold in the darkness. Her father was teaching Marco to play chess with pieces carved from walrus ivory, moving the boy's pudgy fingers to show him how the knight jumped. Her mother sat near the fire, her needlework forgotten in her lap, humming that endless wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought. Old Benedetto dozed in his chair, occasionally startling awake to add a completely unrelated comment to whatever conversation was happening. And later, she sat in the window seat, her favorite perch, where she could feel the cold radiating from the glass while her back stayed warm from the room's heat. She was watching the snow fall in the courtyard, each flake visible for a moment in the light from the windows before disappearing into the greater whiteness. It was then she understood that she was living in a story, not a grand epic, but one of those quiet tales that get passed down in whispers, in lullabies, in the spaces between words. Spring came late that year, arriving all at once like an apology. One day the world was white and silent. The next, water was running everywhere, from roofs, from gutters, turning the courtyard into a temporary lake that reflected the sky so perfectly it seemed you could step through it into another world. The sound of all that melting, that flowing, was like the earth laughing after holding its breath too long. With the thaw came news from the outside world, carried by muddy, exhausted messengers. The large kingdoms were indeed stirring. Alliances were being formed and reformed like dancers changing partners. Valdora, small, peaceful Valdora, was being eyed by larger powers not for its wealth. It had little, but for its position. That perfect valley where 3 rivers met. Later watched her parents during this time. Saw how they looked at each other across rooms, entire conversations happening in glances. She saw her father spend longer hours in his study, bent over correspondence that made his shoulders tighten. She saw her mother's fingers move more quickly over her needlework, as if stitching could somehow hold everything in place. But even worry in Veldora had a gentle quality. There were no harsh words, no slamming doors. Concern manifested as longer prayers in the chapel, as extra care taken with the spring planting, as more frequent checks on the duchy's old walls. Not that those walls could withstand any serious assault. They were built for privacy, not war. It was during this time of quiet concern that Leta discovered she had a gift, though gift might be too grand a word for something so subtle. She could sense what people needed before they asked, sometimes before they knew themselves. She would appear at Brother Francis's elbow with a cup of that bitter tea he drank for his headaches, just as the pain was beginning. She would find her mother's favorite shawl and drape it over her shoulders, moments before Katerina felt the evening chill. She knew when Marco needed distraction from a scraped knee, or when her father needed to hear her practicing her lute, however badly, to ease the tension in his jaw. This wasn't magic, not really. It was attention. The kind of deep, quiet attention that comes from listening with more than just ears. Leta had learned to read the small signs, the way someone's breathing changed, the angle of their shoulders, the quality of their silence. In a castle where everyone knew everyone else, where the same faces appeared day after day, year after year, such attention was possible, even natural. Summer arrived with its usual grace, painting the valley in shades of green, so various they seemed impossible. The dark green of the forest edges, the bright green of new wheat, the silver green of olive trees that someone, optimistic beyond reason, had planted on the southern slope. The roses that Benedetto tended burst into bloom all at once, as if they'd been waiting for some secret signal. Their perfume was so intense that with the right wind, you could smell them from the highest tower. It was decided during one of those soft summer evenings, when the sky stayed light until impossibly late, that Leta should be sent to visit her mother's family in Siena. Just for a season, her parents said, though their eyes said something different. She would learn refinements there, see great art, hear music played by master musicians. She would return by autumn, certainly by winter. The preparation for this journey took on a dreamlike quality. Seamstresses arrived to make new clothes, not grand court dress, but well-made traveling clothes and a few gowns suitable for a minor noble girl visiting relatives. Leta stood still for the fittings, feeling the whisper of silk and wool against her skin, watching in the mirror as she was transformed into someone who might walk through the world beyond Valdora's borders. Her mother gave her a small book, no bigger than her palm, bound in leather soft as rose petals. Inside, in that impossibly small script Katerina had perfected, were recipes, remedies, prayers, and stories. "Keep this close," her mother said, tucking it into a hidden pocket in Leta's traveling cloak. "When you feel far from home, these words will bring you back." The night before her departure, Leta couldn't sleep. She walked through the castle like a ghost, touching walls and door frames, trying to memorize textures. She stood in the kitchen, still warm from the day's baking, breathing in the yeast and flour smell that meant home. She climbed to Benedetto's tower and found the old man there, awake despite the hour, looking at stars through an ancient astrolabe. "Ah, little princess," he said without turning around. "Come to say goodbye to the stars? They'll be the same in Siena, you know. That's the comfort of stars. They care nothing for borders." They stood together in comfortable silence, the night air carrying the sound of the river far below, the occasional call of an owl, the rustle of wind through summer leaves. Leta felt suspended between two worlds, the one she knew with every fiber of her being, and the unknown one that waited just beyond tomorrow's sunrise. When dawn came, painted in shades of pearl and gold, the courtyard filled with the organized chaos of departure. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Servants loaded trunks and bags, checking and double-checking that everything was secure. Her father lifted her onto her horse, not old Stella, but a younger mare chosen for the journey, and adjusted her cloak around her with hands that trembled slightly. Her mother stood very straight, Marco held against her hip, his face buried in her shoulder. When Leta looked down at her from the height of the horse, Katerina smiled. A smile that held everything and promised everything and asked for everything all at once. "Remember, my dove," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "You carry Valdora with you. In your heart, in your memories, in the way you see the world. That can never be taken from you." The party began to move, horses' hooves clattering on cobblestones, then softening to thuds as they passed through the gates onto the earthen road. Leta turned in her saddle to look back, seeing the castle honey golden in the early light, seeing the small figures still standing in the courtyard, growing smaller with each step the horses took. She didn't know then that she would never see it again. Not like this. Not whole and peaceful and eternal seeming as morning. She didn't know that within a year, the larger kingdoms would swallow Valdora like a large fish swallows a small one. That her parents would make choices that saved their people but erased their sovereignty. That the castle would become a footnote in someone else's history. But in that moment, riding away on that summer morning, she carried it all with her. The sound of the chapel bell, the smell of Benedetto's roses, the feeling of her mother's fingers braiding her hair, the weight of her father's hand on her head in blessing. She carried the texture of those honey-colored stones, warm with afternoon sun. She carried the taste of quinces from the ancient trees, the particular blue of winter twilight seen from her window, the way dust motes danced in the library's slanted light. The road wound down into the valley, following the river's course. The sun climbed higher, warming Leta's back through her traveling cloak. Behind them, the castle disappeared behind a fold of hills, but Leta didn't look back again. She had learned, somehow, in her 9 years of life, that the most important things weren't held in place but in memory, not in stones, but in stories. The journey to Siena would take 12 days, her escort captain had told her. 12 days of riding through a world that grew larger with every mile. They would pass through forests where the trees grew so thick that noon became twilight. They would cross rivers on ferries operated by men who spoke in dialects she couldn't quite understand. They would sleep in monastery guest houses where the bells marked time differently than they had in Valdora. But all of that was still ahead. For now, there was just the rhythm of the horse beneath her, the creak of leather, the soft conversation of her escorts, the sound of the river keeping them company. The sun climbed toward its zenith, but somehow its light seemed gentler than usual, filtered through invisible veils into something that blessed rather than burned. The road to Siena unfolded like a ribbon through landscapes that changed as gradually as sleep approaching. By the third day of travel, the familiar hills of Eldora had given way to something wider, more open. Valleys that stretched toward horizons Leta had never imagined could be so far away. The cypress trees that began to appear, standing like dark green sentinels against the gold-brown earth, told her they were entering Tuscan lands. At night, in the monastery guest houses, Leta would lie on narrow beds that smelled of lavender and age, listening to the different quality of silence. It wasn't the embracing quiet of Eldora's castle. This was the quiet of strangers, of stone walls that had heard countless other travelers' dreams. She would pull out her mother's little book and read by candlelight, the tiny words swimming before her tired eyes, until they became not words at all but a kind of visual lullaby. Her escorts were kind men, chosen by her father for their steadiness rather than their sword skills. There was Giuseppe, the captain, whose beard was more grey than black and who had a way of humming under his breath that reminded Leta of wind in pine trees. There was young Paolo, barely out of boyhood himself, who blushed whenever Leta spoke to him directly. And there was Tommaso, who had been to Siena before and filled the long riding hours with stories about the city's marvels. Its cathedral striped like a great stone zebra, its campo where horses raced in wild pageants, its towers that families built to show their importance, each one trying to stretch closer to heaven than their neighbors. On the fifth day, they encountered a group of pilgrims heading to Rome. They walked slowly, some barefoot despite the stones, singing hymns in Latin that seemed to rise from the road itself. When they stopped to share water at a well, an old pilgrim woman touched Leta's cheek with fingers as light as butterfly wings. "Such a young traveler," she murmured. "May the road rise gently to meet you, child. May all your journeys lead you home." Leta wanted to tell her that she was going to Siena, not on pilgrimage, that she would be home by winter. But something in the woman's eyes, kind and knowing and touched with a sadness that seemed ancient, made the words stick in her throat. Instead, she simply smiled and thanked her for the blessing. The landscape continued its slow transformation. The forests thinned, giving way to cultivated lands where grapevines marched in orderly rows and olive groves shimmered silver green in the afternoon heat. The air itself changed, becoming drier, carrying the scent of wild herbs, rosemary and thyme that grew without anyone's permission or care. When they stopped to rest the horses, Leta would pick sprigs of these herbs, crushing them between her fingers to release their sharp, clean fragrance. On the seventh night, they stayed not in a monastery, but in a merchant's house, a friend of her father's who traded in wool and wine. His villa sat on a hillside, surrounded by gardens that had been tamed into geometric patterns. At dinner, served in a hall where the walls were painted with scenes of plenty, fruit trees heavy with impossible harvests, rivers thick with leaping fish. Leta sat quietly while the adults talked of trade routes and tariffs, of which kingdoms were stable and which teetered on the edge of change. The merchant's wife, a woman whose every gesture seemed practiced and perfect, watched Leta with eyes that missed nothing. "You have the look of your mother," she said finally, when the men had moved on to discussing wine. "The same way of listening, as if you're hearing more than what's being said." That night, in a bed that was too soft after nights of monastery cots, Leta dreamed of Valdora. But it was Valdora transformed, The castle walls were made of golden thread. The gardens bloomed with flowers that chimed like bells, and everyone she loved moved through the rooms and corridors in an endless, peaceful dance. She woke with tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say whether they were from sadness or from beauty. The closer they drew to Siena, the more the world seemed to quicken. More travelers appeared on the roads, merchants with their guarded caravans, noble parties with their bright banners, common folk walking to market with baskets of goods. The quiet of the journey's early days gave way to a constant murmur of voices, wheels, hoofbeats. Leta found herself shrinking into her cloak, overwhelmed by the sudden abundance of strangers. Giuseppe noticed her discomfort. On the 10th day, when the road was particularly crowded, he maneuvered his horse close to hers. "It's like learning to swim, little princess," he said quietly. "At first, all that water seems like it will drown you, but then you learn to float, to let it hold you up. Cities are the same. All those people, they're just water. You'll learn to float." The first glimpse of Siena came at sunset on the 11th day. They had climbed a long winding road, the horses laboring in the heat, when suddenly the city appeared, a vision of rose-colored stone and reaching towers, church bells catching the dying light like scattered gold coins. It seemed to grow from the hilltops themselves, as if the earth had decided to reach toward heaven and frozen midway in beautiful incompletion. Leta's breath caught. It was magnificent and terrible at once, so different from Valdora's gentle sprawl. This was a city that announced itself, that demanded attention. Even from a distance she could hear it, a hum like a giant beehive. Thousands of lives creating a single complex sound. They entered the city the next morning through gates so tall Leta had to crane her neck to see their tops. The streets were narrow and steep, paved with stones worn smooth by countless feet. Buildings rose on either side like canyon walls, their windows watching like curious eyes. The smells were overwhelming. Bread and horse dung, perfume and sweat, incense from churches and smoke from forges, all mixing into something thick and dizzying. Her mother's family lived in a palazzo near the Campo, the shell-shaped central square that was Siena's heart. The building was narrow but tall, squeezed between its neighbors like a book on a tight shelf. Its facade was decorated with carved stone flowers and fruits. Delicate work that must have taken master craftsmen months to complete. When Leta looked up at it, she felt very small, like a single seed contemplating an entire garden. The door was opened by a servant in livery finer than anything worn in Valdora's castle. He bowed deeply, too deeply for such a minor princess, and led them through a courtyard where a fountain played. Water falling from tier to tier with a sound like continuous, gentle laughter. The walls were covered with frescoes, scenes of paradise where angels floated through gardens that looked nothing like real gardens, but everything like the idea of gardens. Her aunt, Elisabetta, for whom Leta had been named, descended a staircase that seemed designed for entrances. She was her mother's older sister, but where Caterina had softness, Elisabetta had angles, sharp cheekbones, a nose that could cut paper, hands that moved in quick, decisive gestures. She examined Leta with eyes the same grey-green as her own, taking in the travel dust, the simple clothes, the way Leta stood with her weight slightly back on her heels, ready to retreat. "So," Elisabetta said, her voice carrying the music of Italian, but with notes of judgment Katerina's never held. "You are my sister's daughter. We shall have to do something about everything. But first, you must be tired. Marta will show you to your room." The room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the courtyard. It was beautiful in a way that made Leta uncomfortable. Too many silk cushions, too much gilt on the furniture, curtains so heavy they seemed to swallow light. When Marta, a girl barely older than Leta herself, finally left her alone, Leta stood in the center of all that luxury, feeling more homesick than she had during the entire journey. She pulled out her mother's book and held it against her chest like armor. Through the open window, she could hear the city, vendors calling their wares, church bells marking hours she didn't yet understand. The clip-clop of horses on stone, voices raised in argument or laughter or song. It was like standing beside a waterfall, impressive, overwhelming, and somehow lonely. That first night in Siena, Leta barely slept. The bed was too high, too soft. The night sounds were all wrong. No owl calls, no wind in trees, no comforting creak of ancient wood settling. Instead, there were footsteps on stone, distant voices that never quite ceased, the occasional crash or shout that made her heart race. She finally dozed near dawn, only to be woken what seemed like moments later by Marta pulling back the heavy curtains. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors running in rain. Elisabetta had indeed decided to do something about everything. Leta was fitted for new clothes, elaborate gowns that required assistance to put on and made walking feel like wading through water. Her hair was dressed in complicated arrangements that pulled at her scalp and gave her headaches. She was taught to walk differently. Smaller steps, eyes ahead, but not too far ahead. A way of moving that suggested she was floating rather than actually using her feet. There were lessons too, though not the comfortable, rambling education Brother Francis had provided. These were precise, focused, relentless. A dancing master who rapped her ankles with a stick when her feet were wrong. A music teacher who sighed dramatically at every missed note. A language tutor who insisted she speak only French for entire mornings, leaving her tongue-tied and frustrated. But it was the social education that exhausted her most. Elisabetta's palazzo was a hub of Sienese society. Every afternoon, the salons filled with ladies in elaborate gowns. Their conversations a complex dance of compliments and subtle insults. Information gathered and dispersed like currency. Leta was expected to sit quietly, to observe, to learn the intricate rules of this game she had no interest in playing. She found refuge in unexpected places. The palazzo's chapel was small and usually empty, its silence different from the rest of the building. Deeper, older, more forgiving. She would slip away there when she could, sitting on the hard wooden pews and letting the familiar rhythm of prayers in Latin wash over her like water from home. There was also the kitchen, though Elisabetta would have been horrified to know Leta ventured there. The cook, a massive woman named Benedetta, had arms like hams and a voice like a bellows, but her eyes were kind. She let Leta sit in the corner while she worked, kneading bread with movements that were violent and loving at once, stirring pots that bubbled like cauldrons in fairy tales. "You're not made for this place, little one," Benedetta said one afternoon, not looking up from the pasta she was rolling. "I can see it in how you hold yourself, like a bird that's forgotten it has wings but remembers it should fly. Your mother was the same when she first came here to visit, years and years ago. but she found her way through. You will too. The weeks passed, marked by feast days and market days, by the comings and goings of visitors whose names Leta couldn't keep straight. Summer deepened, the heat becoming something solid, pressing against the stone buildings until they seemed to pulse with it. The air in the narrow streets grew thick, almost chewy. Even the fountains seemed to flow more slowly, their water warming as it fell. Letters from home came rarely, and when they did, were brief. Her father wrote of good harvests, of Marco learning his letters, of Benedetto's roses blooming particularly well. Her mother's letters were even shorter, but between the lines of practical news, fabric purchased, preserves made, prayers said, Leta could read the things not written, the worry, the watching, the waiting for something that had no name but cast a shadow nonetheless. It was during the feast of the Assumption, when all of Siena seemed drunk on religion and wine, that news came which changed everything. Leta was in her room, escaping the crowds and heat, when Elisabetta entered without knocking. Her aunt's face, usually so controlled, was pale and strange, as if she'd seen something that had rearranged her understanding of the world. "There has been a development," Elisabetta said, her voice careful as walking on ice. "Valdora has been absorbed by the Duke of Ferrara. It was done peacefully. Your father negotiated terms that protected the people, but the duchy, your father's title, they no longer exist as they were." The words seemed to come from very far away, as if Elisabetta were speaking from the bottom of a well. Leta felt herself becoming very still, the kind of stillness that happens when a heart stops beating for a moment before remembering its job. She thought of the honey-colored castle, of her father's study where maps were quickly rolled up, of her mother stitching as if she could hold the world together with thread. "Your parents," Elisabetta continued, each word seemingly pulled from her throat with effort, "have accepted positions in Ferrara's court. Administrative roles. Honorable, but different. You are to remain here, to complete your education. Siena is safer, they say. More stable. You'll be well cared for." The rest of what her aunt said dissolved into meaningless sound. Leta nodded at appropriate moments, her training in proper behavior operating independently of her thoughts. When Elisabetta finally left, Leta remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. That night, she pulled out her mother's book and read it by candlelight until the words blurred. Recipes for times of plenty and times of want. Remedies for ailments of body and spirit. Stories that began once in a time before time and ended with promises that everything eventually finds its way home. At the very back, in writing so small, Leta had to squint to read it. Her mother had written, "Remember, my dove, kingdoms rise and fall like breath, but love remains. You are loved. You have always been loved. You will always be loved." The candle burned down to nothing, and Leta sat in the darkness, listening to Siena's restless sleep sounds. Somewhere, a cat yowled. Somewhere, a baby cried and was comforted. Somewhere, voices rose in argument or song. It was hard to tell the difference. She thought of Valdora, probably sleeping peacefully under stars that, as Benedetto had promised, looked exactly the same. She wondered if the castle's honey-colored stones still held the day's warmth. She wondered if anyone remembered to water Benedetto's roses. She must have slept, because she woke to find herself still in the chair, her neck aching, her mother's book pressed against her chest. The morning bells were ringing. Not Valdora's single gentle bell, but dozens of voices in bronze, each church claiming its moment, creating a cacophony that was somehow also a harmony. The days after the news took on a different quality. The lessons continued, the social occasions proceeded. The rhythms of the palazzo maintained their elaborate dance. But Leta moved through it all as if wrapped in invisible cotton, present but separate, there but not there. Elisabetta watched her with something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. With her, it was always hard to tell. Autumn arrived suddenly, announced by a wind that swept down from the north, carrying the scent of coming rain and dying leaves. The light changed, becoming golden and slanted, turning Siena's rose-colored stones to amber. The crowds in the streets thinned as the heat finally broke, and Leta could walk to the cathedral without feeling suffocated. The cathedral became another refuge. Its black and white stripes should have been severe, but instead they created a kind of visual rhythm, like breath made stone. Inside, the space soared impossibly high, pulling thoughts and prayers upward. The floor was a masterwork of inlaid marble, depicting stories from scripture and myth in stone. Leta would walk slowly across these stone stories, her soft shoes making no sound, feeling like she was walking through dreams. It was there, on an afternoon when rain painted the high windows grey, that Leta met Sister Margherita, not her nurse from Valdora. This was a different Margherita, though the coincidence of the name felt like a small gift from a universe that had recently seemed sparse with gifts. This Margherita was young, perhaps 20, with a face that would have been plain except for eyes that held depths of kindness. "You come here often," Sister Margherita said, not a question but an observation. She had been arranging flowers at a side altar, her movements careful and loving. "I've seen you walking the stories in the floor. Do they speak to you?" Leta found herself telling this stranger what she couldn't tell her aunt, couldn't write to her parents, couldn't even fully tell herself. About Valdora, about loss that wasn't death but felt like it, about being a princess of nowhere, a girl suspended between what was and what might be. Sister Margherita listened without interrupting, her hands continuing their work with the flowers, white lilies that seemed to glow in the cathedral's dim light. When Leta finally stopped talking, embarrassed by her outpouring, the sister was quiet for a moment that stretched like dough being kneaded. "Loss is a strange teacher," she finally said, her voice soft as the lily scent. "It shows us that everything we think is solid, kingdoms, titles, even the ground beneath our feet, is actually flowing like water. The only solid things are the ones we carry inside: love, memory, the capacity for kindness. These cannot be absorbed by any duchy, cannot be negotiated away." They began meeting regularly, these two Margaritas in Leta's life forming a strange symmetry. The sister taught her things that weren't in any of her official lessons: how to make ink from oak galls and iron, how to bind books with thread and prayer, how to illuminate letters with gold leaf so thin it was like captured breath. These were skills for preservation, for making beautiful things that might last longer than kingdoms. Winter came to Siena differently than it had to Valdora. No deep, muffling snows, just rain and occasional ice that made the steep streets treacherous. The palazzo grew cold despite the fires kept constantly burning, the stone walls holding chill like a grudge. Leta learned to dress in layers, silk upon wool upon linen, until she felt like one of those Russian dolls, a person within a person within a person. Letters from her parents became even rarer. When they came, they spoke of their new life in Ferrara in carefully cheerful terms. Marco was growing tall. Her father was valued for his knowledge of river trade. Her mother had started a new garden. Between every line, Leta read the unwritten truth. They were safe but diminished, grateful but grieving, together but incomplete without her. She tried to write back, to match their cheerful tone, but the words felt false on the page. How could she explain that she was well-fed but hungry, well-dressed but naked, surrounded by people but alone? How could she tell them that she dreamed every night of Valdora? But the dreams were fading at the edges, like those tapestries in the forgotten room. Beautiful, but incomplete. Elisabetta decided Leta needed to be presented to wider society. There were balls to attend, concerts to be seen at. Religious processions where being seen was more important than processing. Leta learned to dance the new dances that were nothing like the slow pavanes of her childhood. She learned to use a fan as punctuation, each flutter and fold conveying different meanings. She learned to smile without showing too much happiness, to laugh without making too much sound, to be present without taking up space. At one particularly grand ball, held in a palazzo that made Elisabetta's look modest, Leta found herself standing on a balcony, escaping the heat and noise of the dancing. The city spread below her, lit by torches and candles until it looked like the night sky had fallen to earth. She was joined by a young man, perhaps 17 to her 13 years, who introduced himself as Lorenzo, a distant cousin of somebody important. "You're the Valdora princess?" he said, not unkindly, but with the casual thoughtlessness of someone who had never lost anything that mattered. "I heard about the absorption. Peaceful at least. Better than siege and fire, no?" Leta looked at him, this handsome boy with his untroubled eyes, and realized he genuinely thought he was being comforting. "Yes," she said quietly, "better than fire." But she thought of how fire at least was honest in its destruction, while peaceful absorption was like being slowly dissolved, leaving no dramatic story for anyone to remember. Spring returned, as it always did, as it always would. The hills around Siena turned green overnight, as if nature had remembered a forgotten appointment. Windows were thrown open, heavy curtains replaced with gauze, and the city seemed to stretch and yawn after winter's compression. Leta had been in Siena nearly a year, and she could navigate its streets now without getting lost, could participate in its social rhythms without constant concentration. But she remained a visitor in her own life, watching it rather than living it. She had grown taller, her face losing its childhood roundness. Elisabetta proclaimed her presentable, which was apparently high praise. There was talk of potential marriages, though at 13 she was still considered a year or two too young. The discussions happened around her rather than with her, as if she were a particularly valuable vase being assessed for sale. It was Sister Margherita who gave her a different future to imagine. One afternoon in the cathedral, as they worked together on illuminating a psalter, the sister mentioned, seemingly casually, that there was a convent school in the countryside, a place where noble girls could receive education without necessarily taking vows, a place where learning was valued over beauty, where preservation of knowledge mattered more than preservation of bloodlines. It's called Santa Clara, the sister said, adding a tiny gold leaf star to the margin of the page. The abbess is remarkable. She was a princess herself once, from a kingdom that no longer exists. She understands what it means to carry a vanished world inside you. Leta's hand stilled on her own work. Would someone like me be welcome there? Sister Margarita smiled, that smile that transformed her plain face into something luminous. My child, Santa Clara specializes in welcoming the displaced, noble girls whose families have fallen, whose kingdoms have been absorbed, whose stories don't fit the simple narratives. The abbess believes that such girls have a particular wisdom, born from loss, that can be transformed into something useful. The conversation about Santa Clara planted itself in Leta's mind like a seed in prepared soil, growing quietly through the remaining weeks of spring. She found herself imagining this place where displaced princesses gathered like birds blown from their original nests by storms, wondering what songs they might sing together, what stories they might share in the evening when the day's lessons were done and darkness made all voices equal. Elisabetta was surprisingly receptive when Leta finally gathered courage to mention it, though her reasons were practical rather than sympathetic. A few years of proper convent education would increase your value considerably, her aunt said, examining Leta with those sharp eyes that saw everything as currency. The appearance of piety combined with your bloodline? Yes, it could work well. And honestly, child, you've been drifting through my house like a ghost for months. Perhaps you need the structure of religious life, even if temporarily. Letters were written, arrangements made with the efficiency that Elisabetta brought to all transactions. Within 6 weeks, it was settled. Leta would go to Santa Clara after the feast of San Giovanni, when the summer heat made travel bearable and the roads were dry enough for carriages. She would stay for 3 years initially, though this could be extended if. And here Elisabetta's voice took on a particular tone, if circumstances warranted it. The remaining time in Siena passed in a strange suspension, like the pause between breathing in and breathing out. Later continued her lessons, attended the required social functions, sat through the afternoon gatherings where women's voices rose and fell, like elaborate music. But she was already partly gone, her thoughts drifting toward this unknown sanctuary where perhaps, she might find something she hadn't known she was looking for. Sister Margarita helped her prepare in ways that had nothing to do with packing trunks. In their final weeks together, she taught Leta the art of copying texts, not just the forming of letters, but the meditation of it. The way the repeated movements of the quill could become a kind of prayer. At Santa Clara, she said, guiding Leta's hand to show the proper angle for holding the quill, you'll find that preservation is considered a sacred act, not just of words but of memories, stories, ways of being that might otherwise vanish like morning mist. The journey to Santa Clara took only 2 days, but they were 2 days that seemed to exist outside normal time. The convent lay northwest of Siena, in hills that rolled like green waves frozen mid-motion. The road was less traveled than the main thoroughfares, winding through villages so small they seemed like afterthoughts, past orchards where peaches were beginning to blush with ripeness, through forests where the light filtered down in columns like the cathedral's interior made manifest in nature. Later traveled, with only a small escort this time. Just 2 guards and a maid who would return to Siena once Leta was delivered. The simplicity of it felt like shedding heavy clothing, like emerging from those elaborate gowns into something that could actually breathe. As they climbed higher onto the hills, the air grew cooler, cleaner, carrying the scent of wild herbs and pine resin. The first glimpse of Santa Clara came at evening, when the sun was low enough to turn everything golden. A cluster of buildings that seemed to have grown from the hillside rather than been built upon it. The stones were not honey-colored, like Valdora's, or rose-tinted like Siena's, but a soft grey that caught the light and held it gently, like hands cupping water. The bell tower was modest, the walls were low, and there was something about the proportions that suggested welcome rather than defense. They were met at the gates by the portress, an elderly nun whose face was a map of wrinkles, each line seemingly drawn by years of smiling. She said nothing, just nodded and led them through a courtyard where a fountain played so softly it sounded like whispered conversation. The buildings formed a square around this courtyard, creating a world within a world, complete and self-contained. The abbess received them in a room that was simple but not austere. Whitewashed walls, dark wooden beams, windows that looked out over valleys folding into evening shadow. She was perhaps 50, with silver hair visible at the edges of her veil, and eyes the color of winter seas. When she looked at Leta, it was with a gaze that seemed to see not just who Leta was, but who she had been and who she might become. "Leta of Eldora," the abbess said, and hearing her lost title spoken aloud, even attached to a place that no longer existed, made Leta's throat tight. "Sister Margarita wrote of you. She said you carry your vanished kingdom with unusual grace. That is a rare gift, child. Many who lose their worlds either cling too tightly or let go too completely. The art is in learning to hold loosely, like carrying water in cupped hands. Keeping what you can while accepting what spills through." That first night at Santa Clara, Leta lay in a narrow bed, in a room she would share with 3 other girls, listening to their breathing blend with the night sounds. Crickets, a distant owl, wind through pine trees. The mattress was firm, filled with straw that rustled when she moved. The blanket was rough wool, practical rather than comfortable. And yet she felt more at ease than she had in all her months in Siena's silk-draped luxury. The morning bells at Santa Clara were different from any bells Leta had known. Not the commanding bronze voices of city churches or Valdora's gentle single note, but something in between. 3 bells of different sizes that created a harmony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They rang at matins while stars still held the sky, calling the nuns to prayer. The students were allowed to sleep until Lourdes, when dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern mountains. Leta's fellow students were, as Sister Margarita had promised, a gathering of the displaced. There was Beatrice, whose family had ruled a coastal city-state until the Venetians decided they needed that particular harbor. There was Constanza, the daughter of a duke who had chosen the wrong side in one of the endless conflicts between Pope and Emperor. There was Sophia, whose small kingdom had been traded like a playing card in a game between larger powers, and little Marie, only 11, whose father's principality had simply been forgotten, erased from maps as if it had never existed. They were taught by the nuns, Women who had themselves come from various backgrounds, some noble, some common, all carrying their own stories of how they had arrived at this hillside sanctuary. Sister Clemencia taught Latin and Greek, her voice patient as she guided them through the complexities of ancient grammar. Sister Beatitude oversaw the scriptorium, where texts were copied with the concentration of prayer. Sister Agnes managed the herb garden and taught the properties of plants. Which ones healed, which ones harmed, which ones simply made the world smell sweeter. But it was the abbess herself who taught them history. Not the history of battles and treaties, but the history of the forgotten, the overlooked, the absorbed. She would gather them in the evening, when work was done and the light was fading, and tell them stories that weren't written in any chronicles. Stories of queens who ruled through influence rather than decree, of kingdoms that existed for only a generation but changed the course of rivers, of princesses who disappeared from official records but left their mark in songs, in recipes, in the way certain flowers were arranged for certain festivals. History, the abbess said one evening while summer rain drummed gently on the roof, is like a great tapestry. The official chroniclers focus on the large figures, the kings, the battles, the treaties. But if you look closely, you'll see that the background is made up of thousands of tiny stitches, each one necessary, each one contributing to the whole. You, my dear ones, you are those stitches. Your kingdoms may be absorbed, your titles may be forgotten, but you are still part of the tapestry. The days at Santa Clara followed a rhythm as regular as breathing. Prayer, work, study, prayer, meals taken in companionable silence. Evening recreation when they could talk and laugh and be girls rather than displaced princesses. Then prayer again before sleep. It should have been monotonous, but instead it was soothing, like being rocked in an enormous cradle. Leta discovered she had an aptitude for illumination. Not just the mechanical skill of applying gold leaf and colored inks, but an understanding of how decoration could enhance meaning rather than distract from it. Under Sister Beatitude's guidance, she learned to create elaborate initial letters where entire worlds existed. Tiny rabbits hiding in the curves of an S, stars scattered through the loops of a B, flowers growing from the base of an L that reached toward heaven. The seasons turned their great wheel, and Leta watched from the hilltop sanctuary as the valleys below changed their garments. The gold of late summer grain giving way to the russet of autumn vines, then the grey-green of winter when only the olives and pines held their color, then the impossible emerald of spring when everything seemed to exhale green at once. Letters from her parents became even rarer. But when they came, Leta noticed a change in their tone. They seemed lighter somehow, as if they too were learning to hold loosely, to carry their lost kingdom without being crushed by its weight. Marco was growing tall and showing skill with numbers. Perhaps he would become a merchant, their father wrote, and Leta could hear both sadness and hope in those words. Their mother had become known in Ferrara for her knowledge of herbs and remedies, quietly helping those who couldn't afford physicians. Leta wrote back, telling them about Santa Clara, about her fellow displaced princesses, about the books she was learning to illuminate. She didn't tell them about the dreams where Valdora appeared, perfect and golden and forever lost. She didn't tell them about the moments when homesickness hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless. She didn't tell them that she was beginning to understand that some losses were too large for tears, could only be carried in the spaces between heartbeats. It was during her second year at Santa Clara that Leta began to understand what the abbess meant about holding loosely. It started with a realization that came while she was working in the garden, her hands deep in soil, planting seedlings that would become next year's vegetables. The earth didn't care that she had once been a princess. It simply received what she offered, seeds and attention and water, and gave back in its own time. She began to see that all the girls at Santa Clara were learning this same lesson in different ways. Beatrice, who had arrived angry and bitter, began to soften as she discovered a gift for music, her voice rising in the chapel with a purity that made everyone stop what they were doing to listen. Constanza found peace in the precise work of copying mathematical texts, her mind delighting in the absolute truth of numbers. Sophia became the unofficial storyteller, gathering the younger girls around her in the evening to spin tales that mixed memory and imagination until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The abbess watched their transformations with those winter sea eyes that missed nothing. Sometimes she would call one of them for private conversation, always at moments when that particular girl most needed guidance but least expected it. When Leta's turn came, it was after a letter from Elisabetta that mentioned, almost casually, that the castle in Valdora had been torn down to use its stones for a new fortress. Leta had read those words and felt something inside her break. Not dramatically but quietly, like ice cracking under spring sun. She had continued through her day, prayers, lessons, work. But the abbess must have seen something, because that evening she was summoned to that simple room with its view of folding valleys. "Tell me about the stones," the abbess said, without preamble. "The castle stones. What color were they?" "Honey," Leta whispered, her throat tight. "They were honey-colored. In the afternoon sun, they looked like they were made of light." The abbess nodded. "And now those stones are part of a fortress. They're still honey-colored, I imagine. Still catching the light. They're simply arranged differently. The stones themselves haven't ceased to exist. They've been transformed. Like you, child. Like all of us. We are rearranged by loss, not erased by it." That conversation planted something in Leta that grew slowly through the remaining seasons at Santa Clara. She began to see transformation everywhere. In the way grape must became wine, in the way wool became thread, became cloth, in the way Latin words became Italian, became the dialect the local farmer spoke. Everything was always becoming something else, and perhaps that was not loss, but simply the way the world breathed. Her illuminations began to reflect this understanding. The decorations became more flowing, less contained by borders. Vines grew from one page to another, connecting separate texts. Birds flew through margins, carrying messages between psalms. Her work caught the attention of visiting clergy, who commissioned copies for their own libraries. It was suggested, delicately, that Leta might consider taking vows, becoming a permanent part of Santa Clara's community. She had the temperament for it, the skills, the understanding, but something in her knew that wasn't her path, not because she was destined for marriage and motherhood, the usual alternative, but because she sensed she had a different kind of work to do in the world, though she couldn't yet name it. The third year at Santa Clara passed more quickly than the others, the way time accelerates when you know an ending is approaching. Leta was now 16, old enough to be considered a woman, though she felt suspended between girl and adult, like those moments between sleep and waking when you're not quite either. Plans were being made for her future, negotiations conducted through letters between Elisabetta and various parties. There was talk of a position as a companion to a duchess in Mantua, or possibly a marriage to a minor noble with scholarly interests who wouldn't mind a wife who knew Latin and created strange, beautiful books. Leta let these discussions wash over her like water, neither resisting nor engaging, trusting that her path would reveal itself in its own time. Her last months at Santa Clara took on the quality of those honey-colored stones she remembered. Everything seemed to glow with a light that came from within rather than without. She memorized the feeling of morning mist in the valleys, the sound of the 3 bells creating their perfect harmony, the smell of the scriptorium where ink and parchment and gold leaf created an alchemy of preservation. The other displaced princesses gave her gifts as her departure approached. Beatrice sang a song she had composed, wordless but full of meaning. Constanza copied out mathematical proofs in her perfect hand. Because, she said, sometimes we need to remember that some things remain true regardless of kingdoms. Sophia told a story that was clearly about Leta but also about all of them. About a girl who gathered fallen stars and used their light to illuminate manuscripts that would be read by people not yet born. The abbess's farewell was characteristic, practical, and profound in equal measure. She gave Leta a small traveling desk, its wood worn smooth by use, containing quills, inks, and a small knife for sharpening. "You'll continue the work," she said, not a question but a statement. "Not here, but wherever you go. You'll preserve what needs preserving, transform what needs transforming. You've learned to hold loosely, child. Now learn to give freely." The journey away from Santa Clara was different from any of Leta's previous travels. She was no longer a child being delivered somewhere, no longer a girl fleeing or seeking. She was herself, whatever that meant, whoever that was. The hills unfolded before her carriage, each valley revealing another, the landscape continuous but ever-changing, like a story that had no clear beginning or ending but simply was. She was bound for Mantua, to the court of Isabella d'Este, who collected artists and scholars the way others collected jewels. It was Elisabetta's finest arrangement, a position that was neither servant nor guest, but something in between. Something that would allow Leta to use her skills while maintaining her dignity. The Duchess, Elisabetta's letters assured her, appreciated illuminated manuscripts and was particularly interested in preserving the stories of Italy's smaller courts before they vanished entirely. The journey to Mantua took 5 days, winding through a landscape that seemed to be showing off the full glory of early autumn. The poplars had turned gold, standing like enormous candles against the blue sky. The air carried the scent of harvested grapes and the smoke from bonfires where farmers burn the spent vines. Everything seemed to be in the process of beautiful ending, of transformation from one state to another. On the 3rd night, they stayed at an inn near a small lake, its surface so still it could have been polished metal. Leta walked along its shore in the evening, watching the sun sink towards the water, creating a path of gold that looked solid enough to walk on. She thought of all the paths she had traveled, from Valdora to Siena, from Siena to Santa Clara, now from Santa Clara to Mantua. Each journey changing her in ways she was only beginning to understand. A fisherman was pulling in his nets, the motion practiced and patient. He nodded to her, the greeting of one human acknowledging another, requiring no words. His nets came up silver with fish, catching the last light like a miracle of abundance. It was then that Leta understood something the abbess had been trying to teach her, that grace existed in the ordinary, that the sacred was scattered through the everyday like gold leaf through an illuminated page. As they approached Mantua, the landscape changed again, becoming flatter, dominated by the 3 lakes that surrounded the city like protective moats. The city itself rose from this watery plain like something dreamed rather than built. Its towers and domes reflected in the still water until you couldn't tell which was real and which was mirror. Isabella d'Este's palace was everything Santa Clara was not: elaborate, ornate, buzzing with activity and ambition. The walls were covered with frescoes that made you dizzy to look at them. Gods and goddesses tangled in complicated narratives, architectural perspectives that tricked the eye into seeing depth where there was only surface. The courtiers moved through these decorated spaces like actors who had forgotten they were in a play. Their performances so constant, they had become real. Isabella herself was smaller than Leta had expected, but her presence filled whatever room she entered. She was perhaps 40. Her beauty now more about presence than feature, with dark eyes that seemed to be calculating the value of everything they saw. When she looked at Leta, it was with an assessment that was neither kind nor unkind, simply practical. "So," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been denied anything important. "You're the princess who illuminates. Elisabetta says you have a gift for preservation. Good. I have a project that requires someone with your particular background. The smaller courts are disappearing, absorbed or forgotten, and with them go their stories. I want those stories preserved, not in the dry chronicles of official history, but as they were lived. The daily details, the small ceremonies, the particular ways they celebrated feast days. Can you do this?" Leta found herself nodding, understanding that this was why she had been brought here, why all her journeys had led to this moment. She was to be a gatherer of vanished worlds, a preserver of the absorbed, a chronicler of the forgotten. It was work that perhaps only someone like her could do, someone who carried her own vanished world inside her like a secret room. She was given a chamber in the palace, not grand, but comfortable, with good light for working and a view of one of the lakes. She was provided with materials, the finest parchments, inks in colors she had never seen, gold leaf so pure it seemed like captured sunlight. And she was given freedom to move through the court, to listen, to observe, to gather the stories that floated through the palace like dust motes in afternoon light. The work began slowly. Leta would sit in corners during court gatherings, her presence so quiet she became invisible, and listen to the older courtiers reminisce about courts that no longer existed. She heard about the Duke of Montefeltro's palace, where the walls were covered with marquetry so elaborate it looked like painting. She heard about the court of Rimini, where a mad prince had loved a woman so deeply, he rebuilt his entire city to spell out her name when seen from above. She heard about a tiny duchy near the Alps where they celebrated Christmas by hanging golden apples from every tree, creating an orchard of light. Each story she gathered carefully, like eggs collected from hidden nests. In her chamber, by candlelight that made her shadow dance on the walls, she would write them out in her careful hand, decorating the margins with images that captured not just what things looked like, but what they felt like. A festival became a swirl of gold and scarlet. A garden became a tangle of green with hidden birds. A beloved duchess became a figure wrapped in blue so deep it seemed to hold nights inside it. Months at Isabella's court flowed into years like water finding its level, and Leta discovered that she had become something she had never expected. Not quite a courtier, not quite a servant, but something more ancient and necessary. A keeper of memories, a woman who moved through the palace's grand rooms with the quietness of candlelight, gathering stories the way others gathered roses. The Duchess valued her work, though perhaps not in the way Leta had hoped. Isabella saw the illuminated chronicles as possessions, beautiful objects to be displayed alongside her paintings and sculptures, proof of her patronage and taste. But Leta had learned at Santa Clara that sometimes good work happened despite intentions rather than because of them. And so she continued, creating books that were both beautiful and true, preserving worlds that would otherwise dissolve like sugar in rain. Her days developed their own gentle rhythm. Mornings in the scriptorium Isabella had provided, a room where northern light fell clean and steady across her work table. Afternoons moving through the palace, listening to conversations that revealed more than their speakers intended. Evenings in her chamber, transforming what she had gathered into pages that seemed to breathe with their own life. She learned to recognize the particular sadness that lived in the eyes of those who had lost their kingdoms. It was different from other sorrows, quieter, like the ache of a bone that had healed wrong. There was the Countess of Forli, who still dressed in the colors of her fallen house, though no one else remembered what those colors meant. There was the old knight from Urbino, who would describe the palace gardens there with such detail that Leta could smell the lemon trees, though those gardens had been paved over for a fortress. Each story she preserved with the same careful attention she had learned to give to sacred texts. Because weren't they sacred, these memories of places that existed now only in the minds of those who had lived there? She began to see her work not as recording history, but as creating a kind of afterlife for vanished worlds. A place where they could continue to exist, perfect and unchanging, long after the last person who remembered them had gone to dust. One winter evening, when snow fell on Mantua like a benediction, making everything clean and new, Leta received a letter that changed the careful pattern of her days. It was from Marco, her brother, now 20 years old, and indeed a merchant, as their father had predicted. He wrote that their parents had died, not dramatically, but quietly, within weeks of each other, as if they had agreed that they had stayed long enough. Leta read the letter by candlelight, the words swimming before her eyes not from tears. She was beyond tears, but from a kind of vertigo. as if the world had tilted slightly and she was learning to stand in a new relationship to the ground. She was now the last of Valdora's direct line, the only one who remembered the particular gold of morning light in the castle's great hall, the only one who knew how her father's voice sounded when he told stories by firelight. Marco had included something else in his letter, a small packet wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was her mother's book, that tiny volume Katerina had given her so many years ago, its leather cover worn now to the softness of skin. She asked that this be returned to you, Marco wrote. She said you would know what to do with it. Leta held the book against her chest and felt time collapse. She was 9 again, riding away from Valdora on that summer morning. She was 13, reading by candlelight in Siena. She was at Santa Clara, learning to hold loosely. And she was also 43 years old, her hair beginning to silver at the temples. Her fingers stained permanently with ink. A woman who had spent her life preserving other people's memories, while her own grew thin as old silk. That night, she began what would become her final and greatest work. Not a chronicle of a single vanished court, but something larger and stranger, a book of books, where all the stories she had gathered would be woven together like threads in a tapestry. She would include her mother's recipes between accounts of forgotten festivals. She would paint the margins with flowers from gardens that no longer existed. She would create a world made entirely of lost worlds, a kingdom built from vanished kingdoms. The work consumed her in a way nothing had before. She found herself rising earlier, staying up later, forgetting meals until someone, usually Maria, the young servant assigned to her, brought bread and wine to her workroom. The pages accumulated slowly, each one a small miracle of preservation. Here was the court of Spoleto's tradition of singing to their olive trees. Here was the way light fell through the rose window of a cathedral that had been destroyed by earthquake. Here was the recipe for the almond cakes her mother had brought from Siena, the ink infused somehow with their phantom sweetness. Isabella watched Leta's transformation with interest that might have been concern if the Duchess had been capable of such feeling. "You're disappearing into your work," she said one day, finding Leta in the scriptorium at an hour when everyone else was at Mass. "One might think you were preparing to enter a convent after all." But Leta wasn't preparing for a convent. She was preparing for something else. Though she couldn't have said what. She only knew that the book was pulling her forward, demanding to be completed, as if all the vanished worlds she had gathered were insisting on their resurrection, their preservation in more permanent form than memory. Years passed in this fever of creation. 5, then 7, then 10. Later aged in the way of women who live interior lives quietly, gradually, like a book's pages yellowing so slowly you don't notice until you compare them to fresh parchment. Her hair went fully grey, then white. Her fingers developed the permanent curve of those who hold quills more than they hold anything else. Her eyes, those listening eyes the old astronomer had identified so long ago, developed the soft focus of those who see better in memory than in the present. The palace around her changed too. Isabella aged, though she fought it with all the weapons wealth could provide. Fashions shifted, making the elaborate gowns of Leta's youth look quaint. New wars were fought, new alliances formed, New kingdoms absorbed into larger powers. But in Leta's workroom, time moved differently, or perhaps didn't move at all. There the vanished courts lived on, perfect and eternal, preserved in ink and gold. She began to have visitors, scholars who had heard of her work, younger sons and daughters of absorbed kingdoms who came seeking news of their heritage. Leta received them all with the same quiet grace, sharing what she knew, showing them pages where their ancestors' worlds lived on. Some wept at seeing their family colors preserved in an illuminated border. Others sat in silence, running their fingers just above the parchment as if they could feel the warmth of vanished suns. One visitor was different from the others, a young woman, perhaps 16, with grey-green eyes that seemed familiar though Leta couldn't place them. She introduced herself as Katerina, granddaughter of Leta's Aunt Elisabetta, and therefore Leta's own great-niece. She had come from Siena with a proposal, or rather, a request. "There is a place," the girl said, her young voice careful with the weight of what she was saying. "A villa in the hills above Siena. It belonged to my grandmother. She left it to me, though I don't know why. It's quiet there, peaceful. Perfect for someone who needs space and silence to complete important work. I would be honored if you would consider it as a gift, not a loan. A place where your book could be finished without the distractions of court." Leta looked at this child who shared her mother's name, her aunt's sharp intelligence, her own questioning eyes, and saw the hand of time arranging things in patterns too complex for human understanding. She accepted the offer with grace that surprised them both, understanding that sometimes the world provides what we need just when we are too tired to keep seeking it. The villa above Siena was indeed perfect, small enough to be manageable, large enough to hold both Leta and her work. It sat among olive groves and vineyards that had been tended by the same families for generations. The walls were that particular golden stone that Tuscany seemed to specialize in, warm to the touch even on cool mornings. There was a tower room where the light was perfect, where Leta could work, surrounded by windows that showed the changing seasons like a slow circular story. She brought everything with her, the hundreds of pages she had already completed, the materials for more, the books and notes she had accumulated over decades. Maria came too, the no longer young servant who had become more friend than attendant, who knew exactly how Leta liked her ink mixed, exactly when she needed to be reminded to eat, exactly when to be silent and when to speak. The work on the great book continued, but at a different pace now. Slower, more contemplative, like a river approaching the sea and spreading out, no longer in any hurry to arrive. Leta found herself adding layers to pages she had thought complete. Tiny details in margins, gold stars scattered like secret messages, flowers that seemed to grow from one page to the next, as if the book itself were a living garden. Visitors still came, but less frequently, and Leta found she preferred it that way. When they did come, they were usually the ones who truly needed what she was preserving. A young man whose grandfather had been the last duke of somewhere, seeking confirmation that his memories of childhood stories were real. An elderly woman who had been a child in one of the vanished courts, wanting to see it one more time before her own memory failed. A scholar from Paris who was writing a history of forgotten kingdoms and had heard that Leta's work contained truths not found in any official chronicle. The seasons turned their great wheel, and Leta watched from her tower room. Spring brought white clouds of almond blossoms. Summer turned the hills gold and amber. Autumn set the vineyards on fire with color. Winter wrapped everything in a quietness that felt like being held in gentle hands. Each season she captured in her work, not directly but as metaphor, as mood, as the particular quality of light that illuminated a memory of a court that had celebrated that season in some unique way. She began to realize that she was not just preserving the vanished courts but creating something new from their combined essence. A kingdom that had never existed but was more real than many that had. A place where all the lost princesses could gather, where all the absorbed duchies could exist side by side, where every forgotten tradition could be practiced forever. It was a kingdom that existed only in ink and imagination, but isn't that where all kingdoms truly exist? Even the ones we call real? Her eyes began to fail, not dramatically but gradually, like evening approaching on a summer day. The tiny details that had been her specialty became harder to execute. She could no longer create those minute decorations where entire worlds existed in the curve of a letter. Maria learned to mix her inks darker so she could see them better, to rule her lines more clearly, to read aloud to her from her own earlier pages when she needed to check something. Young. Katerina visited occasionally, always bringing news from the larger world that Leta listened to with polite disinterest. New popes were elected, new wars were declared, new marriages arranged that would shift the balance of power. But in Leta's tower room, these events seemed no more real than the stories she was preserving. Perhaps less real, since they would themselves one day become stories, while her stories had achieved their final form. One autumn day, when the light was particularly golden, as if the air itself had been transmuted, Leta realized she was approaching the end of her great work. Not because she had run out of stories to preserve, those were infinite, but because the book itself had achieved completeness. The way a symphony reaches its final note, not because the composer has run out of music, but because the pattern is complete. She spent her remaining strength on the final pages, not chronicles of chords, but something different. Instructions for reading the book, for understanding what it truly was. "This is not history," she wrote in a hand that trembled slightly but remained beautiful. "This is memory transformed into dream crystallized into beauty. These courts existed and didn't exist. These princesses were real and were myths. These stories are true and are invented. Read them when the world seems too sharp, too bright, too loud. Read them and remember that everything passes, but in passing becomes eternal." The last page she decorated with a garden. Not any specific garden from any specific court, but all gardens, every garden, the idea of gardens. Trees whose fruit were golden suns, flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, paths that led everywhere and nowhere, fountains whose water was liquid light. And hidden throughout, so small you had to look carefully to see them, were figures. Princesses and duchesses, lords and servants, children and elders. All the people from all the vanished courts gathered together in this impossible garden, frozen in a moment of perfect peace. When the work was complete, Leta felt something release in her chest. like a breath she had been holding for decades, like a bird she had been sheltering in her hands, finally ready to fly. She sat back in her chair, looking at the stack of pages that represented her life's work, and felt empty, but beautifully empty, like a clear glass vessel waiting to be filled with light. Maria found her there the next morning, still in her chair, her hand resting on the final page of the great work. She had died sometime in the night, so peacefully that her expression was one of satisfaction rather than struggle, as if she had simply decided her work was done and it was time to join the stories she had spent her life preserving. The book survived as Leta had known it would. It was copied, though never perfectly. The copyists couldn't quite capture the quality of her illuminations, the way her decorations seemed to breathe with their own life. Parts of it were separated, individual stories extracted and circulated independently. Some pages were lost, others were found centuries later in unexpected places. A monastery in the Alps, a merchant's house in Venice, a forgotten room in what had once been Isabella d'Este's palace. But the book's influence spread in ways more subtle than simple copying. Those who read it found themselves changed, made more gentle, more attentive to the small beauties that exist in every life. They began to notice the way light fell through windows, the particular smell of their grandmother's kitchen, the stories hidden in their own family's history. They began to understand that every life is a kingdom, every person a repository of vanished worlds. Young Katerina inherited not just the villa but Leta's legacy. She established a small school there, a place where girls who had lost their places in the world could come to learn the arts of preservation. Not just illumination and copying, but the deeper arts of attention, of memory, of transforming loss into beauty. The school lasted for 3 generations before it too was absorbed, transformed into something else, its story becoming another layer in the endless palimpsest of history. But even now, in libraries and private collections, in museums and forgotten archives, pages from Leta's great work still surface. A scholar in Prague finds a description of a water garden that makes her weep without knowing why. A collector in London discovers an illuminated letter where the entire story of a forgotten princess is told in the tangle of vines that form its decoration. A child in a library somewhere, bored and browsing, opens a book of reproductions and sees one of Leta's garden pages, and something in her heart recognizes it as home. The original book, or most of it, rests now in a climate-controlled vault in a university library, available only to serious scholars who must wear white gloves and work under supervision. But sometimes, late at night when the library is closed, the security guards swear they can hear something. Not quite singing, not quite whispering, but something like the sound of pages turning by themselves, of stories telling themselves to the darkness, of vanished worlds continuing their quiet existence in the space between what was and what is remembered. And later, she became what she had always been becoming, a story herself, half history and half legend. The princess who slipped out of history only to slip back in through a different door. The woman who saved kingdoms by accepting their loss. The illuminator who made the margins more important than the text. She exists now in the same realm as all the quotes she preserved, neither real nor unreal, but something more permanent than either. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the light is golden and the world seems to pause in its turning. Someone, somewhere opens one of her pages, and for a moment, all the vanished kingdoms live again. Valdora rises from its valley, honey-colored and eternal. The forgotten princesses dance their slow pavans in halls that no longer exist. The absorbed duchies celebrate their particular festivals under skies that remember their songs. And Leta sits in her tower room, forever completing her final page, forever preserving what would otherwise be lost, forever transforming sorrow into something beautiful enough to help us sleep. The story spreads out now like water, like evening, like the approach of peaceful sleep. All the threads weaving together and apart, the patterns clear and unclear at once. The kingdoms rise and fall like breath. The princesses appear and disappear like stars behind clouds. The stories tell themselves in whispers that grow softer and softer until they're indistinguishable from the sound of your own breathing. And perhaps if you listen very carefully, in that space between waking and sleeping, you can hear them too. All those vanished worlds continuing their quiet existence. All those forgotten stories writing themselves in the darkness. All those lost princesses finding their way home through the corridors of dream. They're there in the settling of your house at night, in the whisper of wind through leaves, in the particular quality of darkness that comes just before sleep. Leta's story becomes your story, becomes everyone's story. The tale of carrying what's lost, of preserving what's precious, of finding beauty in endings. Her illuminated pages glow softly in the darkness of memory. Gold leaf stars scattered across the margins of consciousness. Flowers that bloom in the gardens of sleep. And somewhere, in a villa above Siena that exists outside of time, she's still there, still working by candlelight, still preserving the worlds that would otherwise vanish, still showing us that nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. The night deepens around you now, soft as old velvet, gentle as worn silk. The story begins to dissolve at its edges, becoming less narrative and more feeling, less words and more rhythm, less listening and more dreaming. You can feel yourself becoming part of it, another court to be preserved, another kingdom to be remembered, another story settling into its eternal form. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry, woven through with golden threads of memory, decorated with the illuminations of dream. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits in tomorrow's darkness, or perhaps just peaceful sleep, where all the kingdoms are safe, all the princesses are home, all the stories are preserved forever in the soft amber of dream.